Hi, Rudy. Hi, Jacob. It's such a pleasure to have this moment to chat today, and I guess to reflect on your practice, but also to introduce people to your latest Serpentine Commission, Sweet Rebellion. I guess as artists, you work with drawing, mural painting, and printmaking, and explore themes such as Black histories, Afrofuturism, gender and sexuality. And you aim to amplify histories of resistance and nourish new queer anti-colonial narratives. We started working together back in January 2020, which feels like another lifetime ago, where we invited you to develop an iteration of Cracks in the Curriculum, which is a workshop and resource series bringing together artists, educators and activists to address pressing social issues in the classroom. And I thought maybe we could start by you describing your resource, Sweet Rebellion, and how you hope it might be used.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so I'm Rudy and my pronoun is they, them. And Jacob and I made the resource Sweet Rebellion for the age group 11 to 14-year-olds, so years 7 to 9, as part of the Cracks in the Curriculum series. And our intention was that art and history teachers would be able to use it within the curriculum, but also that it could be used by people outside of schools as well.
Yeah, I think that covers everything. That's a really good introduction to what we've done.
Well, maybe you could talk a bit about your initial starting points for the resource. Like, where does that come from?
Well, I think we knew that we wanted to create something that made space for children to question the dominant narratives in society, and to kind of give teachers a chance to creatively engage in those kind of conversations. Myself and Rudy have just been talking about how timely it is, considering the government's move to kind of ban anti-capitalist discussions from the classroom. It seems like even before that legislative change that's happened this last week, it was already kind of, I think, it's not very, there's not that many opportunities, it appears, in the curriculum to have conversations that kind of challenge dominant histories. And I think that one of the groups that definitely inspired our work, and we came to look at some of the stuff around their work, was a group called Advocacy Academy, who were working with kids in schools, teenagers. I think there were sixth form students who were creating their own kind of work around the stuff that they'd like to be featured in the curriculum. So it was definitely inspiring to see young people kind of saying, we want to learn about colonialism, we want to learn about Black history, we want to learn about all these things that have not been included in the curriculum. So, I think those voices, and I imagine like the voices that me and Rudy have encountered in our practices separately before, we kind of knew that there's a desire for this kind of work to happen, and there's an appetite for it. But yeah, maybe you can expand a bit more on that, Rudy.
Yeah, well, I feel like you've probably answered the question, so we can just move on.
Well, I was interested in how this resource relates to other areas of your practice. Maybe you could talk about that relationship.
Yeah, I think that both of us are interested in working around colonial histories, and definitely thinking about the way that the history, in terms of the way that it's been told previously, like what is the narrative, what is the dominant narrative that people in the UK are aware of, and how does that, like what are the other narratives that are possible within that, really thinking about, histories from below, as people would say. So, thinking about like how can we think about different kinds of resistance histories in terms of who was actually involved in the resistance, rather than telling history from the perspective of like the dominant kind of power structure. And we both, you know, work with different kinds of social and political themes within our work. We've both been involved in different activist organizing. You know, we both work with image making, for example. So there's been like a lot of, I think in terms of collaborating, that there was a lot of parallels within our work. And these were like, yeah, themes that were already, you know, important to our practice. And I think individually we're both, you know, continuing to work with looking at the history of colonialism. And yeah, just kind of counteracting some of those truths that have been told that may be actually like not really reliable anymore, you know.
Yeah, and I think also we met through both being interested in making comics, and I think that this resource, you know, it provides an opportunity for young people to engage in comics as a way, and making comics as a way to think about different histories. And also yeah, there's also an element of kind of Afrofuturism embedded in the work as well, and I think that's another theme that is definitely inspired and is visible in some of our work. So yeah, there's lots of different ways. I think Rudy's really covered it with that first thing.
So you developed this resource with a small group of artists and teachers, and then there was a more kind of public workshop where lots of different people came together. Can you talk us through how the resource evolved through this process?
Yeah, I guess we created the kind of initial structure of the resource, and then we were able to test it out with this small group of teachers, parents, you know, people who would be working directly with young people kind of in this way. And we were able to kind of gather a bit more information about which age group it would be appropriate for, like how this could fit into the curriculum in terms of like subject area, and really like thinking about some of the, I guess, challenges in a way that also teachers face, you know, in terms of trying to incorporate materials like this from outside of the school into what they're doing, and how we could try to make it easier for them as well to kind of bring this into the curriculum, you know, because for a lot of teachers, they have to constantly be thinking about, okay, but how does this, you know, kind of check this point and this point within the curriculum. And so we really tried to make that kind of fundamental element of the work that we were doing from the beginning, and really, you know, trying to think about how do we present different kinds of colonial histories while still making it specific to certain age groups, and thinking about, you know, age appropriate language and activities that were going to actually be enjoyable for them, but also, you know, that there was still learning very much at the center of what we were doing.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the resource that we've made is part of the Serpentine's Cracks in the Curriculum program, and I think you know, that's the nature of it. As Rudy says, it's about finding those opportunities within the curriculum that actually, where this can fit in, where can we make it work. But I definitely feel that it was really useful to work with the primary school teacher, Alice Moon, and work with it was great to work with teachers and also parents, is what I was going to say, because I think that hopefully, although we've made this with 11 to 13, 14-year-olds in mind, I think it's also definitely a time when both of us would probably encourage people to be taking education into their own hands where possible, and you know, I think we're going to probably see a rise in supplementary schools and in education happening at home more and more, because of the ways in which the government is not really providing adequate measures to protect families who are already vulnerable from COVID-19. So I think that, yeah, it was great to work with parents as well as teachers. and hopefully some of the other resources that have come out of this cracks in the curriculum program can also be used by parents and people at home.
Yeah, it's a really good point. One moment that really stood out for me in the workshops was the glossary activity, which features on the resource. And it's such a simple idea, but it just completely brought the workshop to life, and the discussions that we had were so engaging and complex. Was there a moment for you that stood out?
I think for me, because we did a workshop at the Black Cultural Archives, where we kind of trialed the resource, and somebody, you know, even just that glossary exercise where people had to come up with definitions for terms based on what they'd read. It was really interesting to see how such a simple exercise can be can cause such interesting conversation. And I think that in a school, you know, children are coming with such wild, different understandings of colonialism. I've worked with schools who, literally children who are in primary school who are like 8 and 9, who understand what colonialism is and understand, you know, what the British Empire, have some understanding of what the British Empire has done to certain countries, probably because they've heard that from their parents. And then I've worked with children who are like 16, 15, who really don't have an understanding of those conversations at all. So I think having an exercise where children are kind of, you know, becoming fact finders and looking through what the resource, and then connecting the dots themselves, is probably going to be a really interesting point of debate and hopefully them teaching each other.
And you've called the resource Sweet Rebellion. Can you talk a bit about why you chose to focus it on sugar plantations?
Yeah, I mean, the reason why we felt that it was really important to focus on sugar plantations is because in terms of the slave trade, sugar plantations were some of the worst working conditions for enslaved people. Sugar plantations had the highest turnovers of enslaved people because you know, they were working just under really, really brutal working conditions, and we felt that it was really important for people to kind of be a bit more aware of that. I think that people don't necessarily think about the kind of like day-to-day violence that enslaved people suffered in those places, and you know, sugar really is a day-to-day part of our lives as well. So I think that it's really important that people make those kind of connections, that, you know, this item that we still have now, like what is the history of this? You know, early on, Jacob and I were talking about different kinds of materials that we have in our day-to-day lives. So, I mean, we could have just as easily have done this for, you know, rubber or cocoa or loads of materials that people don't necessarily think about what is the history behind that and what's the violent history behind that. But I think for both of us, sugar was, yeah, just, you know, really thinking about like the mortality rate of enslaved people is just so shocking. And I think that felt really important to somehow bring into focus, and at the same time, you know, make people aware of the kinds of resistance that was going on. Even under these really brutal conditions, there were still people who were themselves enslaved who were resisting those conditions.
Yeah, and I also think that, you know, it's interesting to go back again to the, you know, I think that sometimes that without meaning to, curriculums and British history can kind of frame Black people as perpetual victims who were completely not able to play any part in their own liberation. And I think that's something that we both wanted to try and remedy with this resource, because, you know, because the sugar plantations were so ubiquitous because they were all over the place across the Caribbean and lots of other parts of the world as well, they really work as a thread to connect a lot of different stories of people who were fighting in different ways. So, you know, you've got people who were campaigners, you've got people, you know, the people that I included in the illustrations that I did and the histories that I was researching. You've got people like Nanny of the Maroons, who freed loads of slaves and set up her own kind of, helped to set up maroon colonies where people could kind of live freely. And then you've got people like the Blue Jab Jabs, the Jab Molasses, like the people who celebrate at Carnival every year. So you've got who've taken, which if you engage with the resource, you'll see that's connected to a history of sugar plantations as well, but I don't know if we've got time to go into it. But one history is a history of joy and celebration, and, you know, taking a violent history and then making it into something that's about embodying freedom and liberation. And the other is about, you know, an act of courage and taking, you know, fighting, literal fighting. So, and the people that Rudy has chosen to center in the resource as well, is really different histories of people having agency and autonomy and their own freedom, which is not something we hear a lot of. In fact, if we do hear those narratives in UK schools, for some reason, they tend to focus on American people like Harriet Tubman, and we don't really hear about our own people who've been part of the British legacy of colonialism.
Great. Is there anything you want to add to that, Rudy, in terms of the stories that you chose to centre?
No, I think that covers everything. Yeah.
Wait, remind me of the people that you centred again, though, because I think I didn't want to get the names. It was Mary Prince
And Sam Sharp.
And Sam Sharp, exactly. And those, you know, those histories are really, really important histories as well. So I'm excited to see what some of the responses are to the resources when they get into the hands of young people, because I think the comics they make are going to be so cool.
Because alongside the narrative, you've illustrated each of the people that you've just spoken about as well, and so the resource will fold out to be this beautiful poster, which I hope people will display on their classroom walls. And through the resource, you encourage children to use drawing to explore ideas of resistance. What do you think that drawing offers that writing and talking alone can't do?
I think that it's different ways of accessing knowledge. You know, I think that what's really important is to understand that not all children learn in the same way, and that it's really important that we offer kids different possibilities to process information. You know, that for some people, maybe having a conversation and writing an essay is really appropriate for them, but for some kids, creative practice is a much easier way to engage them in some of these topics, and especially something like this, which is such a heavy topic. To some degree, it would be quite easy for people to just disengage from what's actually being spoken about because it's so heavy and there's just so much to consider. And I think that when you have creative activities, then you find a way to kind of break it down into smaller pieces, or, you know, getting them to think visually, which has a really different effect on the way that we think about things. So I think that's definitely a big part of it, you know, just trying to think about how can we engage young people in these really big histories in different ways.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, like, it can't be underestimated how diverse the ways in which we learn are. I know you've already just said this, but just to reiterate, like, I'm continuously reminded of how much more I remember things when I engage with them in some kind of creative way. And I just think that, you know, not only is there the thing that Rudy's talking about in terms of the different ways that we learn, but it's also embedded in the resource, by asking children to take these narratives of resistance and to imagine how those narratives of resistance could look in the future in terms of struggles that are ongoing, or struggles that you know, that they might have in their own lives, or they might be, you know, political struggles or global struggles or whatever. It's it's using drawing as a way to create a world, to create a place that we might like to live in, and I think that there is something about having a pen in your hand or a pencil in your hand and drawing something out and sketching it out and playing and experimenting with it that I think hopefully affords young people with a bit of license to be more imaginative about the ways in which they're going to inhabit the world and hopefully change it for the better.
Yeah, and I think also it's about saying that, you know, learning can be playful, that learning doesn't have to be this linear, very like regimented thing, but you can learn in different ways, and that there is space, yeah, there's the space to play and there's space to approach it in different ways, which I think can be really important. You know, I think for some young people, they might think that they don't enjoy learning, and actually the fact is that they might not have been given methods that they enjoyed, and when you start to offer them different alternatives, I think that it can become more engaging.
Definitely. Like, I remember being punished and told off so much when I was at school for doodling and drawing while the teacher was talking, or while we were doing something, you know, while we were meant to be listening. And I realize now I've just started a PhD at Westminster, which is looking into different forms of informal Black arts education historically, and all of the seminars are on Zoom at the moment. And I find that if I'm drawing while I'm talking, like if I'm making do, I remember things so much clearly. And it's like, wow, you know, I almost want to go back in time and say, I think this resource in a way is a way of going back in time and saying, like, this is a valid way of learning things. Like, don't, just because, you know, it's not encouraged doesn't mean it's not useful.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed, as a non-artist, I thoroughly enjoyed the drawing aspect of it. And even though at times I was a bit uncomfortable with it, I felt like, yeah, it really opened up like different possibilities and different ways of thinking about things. So I guess, yeah, I just wanted to thank you for accepting the invitation, and to say what a pleasure it has been to work with you over the last few months. And I'm so pleased with what you've produced. It's absolutely beautiful and powerful. And if you do want to see the Sweet Rebellion resource, it will be available on the Serpentine website, available for download.
So just to go back to what Jacob was saying before, I think that, you know, we're in this moment now, which is really critical in terms of big changes that are happening in terms of legislation and the government, and, you know, just even, yeah, thinking practically about how schools are going to be run. And in a lot of ways, that's what makes these kind of resources really important, because teachers are working under certain conditions, you know, as we see with these education guidelines, which have just been brought in on Thursday, which means that no anti-capitalist organizations can be promoted basically in schools, and this anti-capitalism can't be taught in schools, amongst other various guidelines. And this is going to really radically change how people are allowed to be taught, or what they're allowed to be taught, because this actually affects so many different elements. And I think that you know, we have to think about then what kind of potential do arts institutions and art organizations have, maybe to offer something alongside what's happening in schools, that allow maybe a bit more of a space for critical thinking in ways that maybe schools will no longer be allowed to. So I feel like it's really important to find different ways to engage young people in these histories and social themes. Yeah, and I think that resources like this are a very important way of being able to do that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, like, wasn't there something in the law that's changed about victim narratives or something like this, that you're not allowed to promote stuff, any victim narratives. I can't remember how it was phrased, but it sounded very kind of like coded, like you're not allowed to talk about basically slavery, or you're not allowed to talk about any of the ways in which the UK has kind of enslaved or exploited or any of these kind of things. It feels very scary, the language that they're using. And I think what is giving me hope in this time is the knowledge that the teachers that we have spoken to are very much, I don't think they're just going to roll over and say, okay, I'm just going to change the way that I teach, because teachers are already doing so much work to include histories of activism, of labour struggles, of climate change, of, you know, of slavery abolition, of all these different things which are inherently anti-capitalist. So I don't believe that those teachers are going to just say, okay, well, since the government said it's not allowed anymore, we're going to remove this whole chunk from the curriculum. Because the curriculum, as problematic as it is, in terms of the things that it excludes, it does have a lot of these things that are inherently anti-capitalist embedded in it already. So I think it's a very strange time for people working in schools and people working parallel to schools or around education, like myself and Rudy and yourself, Alex. It's going to be really, yeah, as Rudy says, critical how we respond in this moment.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, maybe that's a moment to draw our chat to a close. And thank you again for this afternoon, and also all of your work on the Tweet Rebellion resource.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us. It's been great.